Thomas, she whispered. The man's hands paused. His eyes looked intently at Elizabeth's face, and then, in surprise, he murmured, "Your Majesty?" "What happened to you, Thomas?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling with sadness. The old stone streets of London were shrouded in the twilight of the evening. The air was cool, the wind blowing over the Thames, echoing through the narrow streets. The light from the street lamps cast shadows, dancing on the sidewalks. Queen Elizabeth was walking through the city with a few bodyguards, mingling with the people to get some air. These moments away from protocol were priceless for her. As she slowly made her way through the hurried steps of people and carriages on their way home, a man on a corner caught her attention. There was a man on the sidewalk, clutching his jacket, patched at the elbows and full of small cuts in many places, as if it were his only possession in life. The old and crumpled hat in front of him was almost empty, with nothing in it but a few coins thrown in sympathy for the man. The man's hands were shaking, and in his lap was an old violin, its varnish peeling off, bearing the weight of years. But the man wasn't playing the violin. He was just running his fingers lightly over the strings, as if trying to recall the melodies of the past in his memory. Queen Elizabeth came up to the man and stopped. Her eyes were locked on him. It was as if he was isolated from the rest of the world. Finally, the Queen broke the silence and spoke. "Can you play me a song?" The man raised his head. His tired eyes traveled over the Queen's face. She didn't seem to recognize him. Perhaps the weariness of the years had seeped into her memory. "My hands are not what they used to be," he whispered. "I used to play once. Once music was my life." Elizabeth smiled slightly. "Music is not something you forget to play," she said. Adam took a deep breath and gripped his violin tighter. He lifted the bow, touching the strings with trembling fingers. As the first notes spread through the air, an indescribable feeling rose in Elizabeth's heart. The melody was faint, but familiar. For a moment, scenes from the past flashed through her mind. The crystal chandeliers, the spacious ballroom, and the same violin sound. She gasped. "Thomas," she whispered. His hands hesitated. His eyes gazed intently into Elizabeth's face. And then, in surprise, he murmured, "Your Majesty?" For a few seconds they both froze, thinking of past memories. Thomas. Years ago he was one of the best musicians in the palace. Although he was younger than the other violin masters, he was an artist who mesmerized with his violin and wowed people in the great halls. But then, he suddenly disappeared. The echoes of the last piece he played that day were still in his ears. "What happened to you, Thomas?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling with sadness. He averted his eyes. "Life," he whispered. "First I hurt my hand, then I lost my job, then my debts mounted. My family fell apart. First I walked away from the stage, then I lost everything. Now all I have is this violin. But even that will leave me now. Look how old it is." Elizabeth's heart clenched. She remembered the days at the palace, sitting by the warm fireplace. In those days, Thomas would play melodies for her on his violin, speaking in the language of music. But now, the man sitting in front of her was only the ashes of the past. "You cannot live like this," the Queen said, her voice firm. Thomas shook his head with a bitter smile. "I am in the past, Your Majesty. My hands are not what they used to be. I can't make music anymore." Elizabeth took a step closer. "But music is not only made with the fingers, Thomas. It is part of the soul." He raised his eyes. It was as if he had heard the words he had been waiting years to hear. Elizabeth's words had sent a shiver through him, but he hesitated. He had long since left that life behind. "Are you summoning me back to the palace, Your Majesty?" he asked. Elizabeth nodded. "If you wish, yes. We still need you at court." But Thomas was unsure of himself. "I am no longer strong enough to play on stage." Elizabeth thought for a moment, then bowed slightly. "Then be behind the scenes, not on stage. Teach young musicians what you know. Inspire them. Thomas took a deep breath. Perhaps the past was not completely behind him. Maybe music was still waiting for him somewhere. That night, Thomas lay in a warm bed for the first time in years. In the morning, he returned to the walls that once echoed with his music. But he was no longer on stage. He was mentoring young musicians, sharing what he knew, shaping their talents. And a year later, in one of the great concert halls, when a young violinist stepped onto the stage, Elizabeth was sitting in the front row. Thomas was next to her. As the young musician played his first note, a melody that had echoed years before returned. Elizabeth turned her head and looked at Thomas. He smiled slightly. Music didn't just come from the strings, it came from the heart. And that night, Thomas's music resonated once more.